instance, the comet was followed, though at a longer interval, by a remarkable paleness of the sun. The sixth return, in the year 1106, is recorded by the chronicles of Europe and China. And in the first fervor of the Crusades, the Christians and the Mohammedans might surmise, with equal reason, that it portended the destruction of the infidels. The seventh phenomenon, of 1680, was presented to the eyes of an enlightened age. The philosophy of Bayle dispelled the prejudice which Milton's muse had so recently adored, that the comet from its horrid hair shakes pestilence and war. Its road in the heavens was observed with exquisite skill by Clancy and Cassini, and the mathematical science of Bernoulli, Newton, and Halley investigated the laws of its revolutions. At the eighth period, in the year 2255, their calculations may perhaps be verified by the astronomers of some future capital in the Siberian or American wilderness. Isn't that a beautiful and interesting passage? I think it's good for students to realize that no matter what mess humanity manages to make of this little planet, the visits of that comet will go serenely on. Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking the panelists in the same order they introduced them, which is the same order as their program, and ask Ron Sass to start.
I was struck after your talk, listening to these talks this morning, the number of physicists that are involved in this subject matter. And I'm wondering why that's true. Perhaps it's because physicists require more need to go down and set people straight at lower levels, put their own house in order than perhaps other sciences do. So since my house is quite in order, I thought maybe I would reflect a bit on physics and see where I could plug into some of these things. A little aside story first. You mentioned the Griffith Park Observatory and its romantic building and so forth. I went to school in Los Angeles College. After having grown up in Iowa a long way away, my choice of universities for graduate school was to draw concentric circles around Iowa and see how far I could get away before college. But my father came out to visit one time with my mother. And my father did not finish high school. In fact, I was the first in the family to go on to the university in any way, shape, or form. And I felt I would enculturate him a little bit into Los Angeles. And we went up to the Griffith Park Observatory. And in the entranceway there is a Foucault Pendulum. And so we're standing here looking at it, and I thought I would let my father know what this was all about. And I said, "Do you know what this is?" And he looked at it for a little while and says, "Yeah, it's a demonstration of the rotational properties of the Earth." And I looked down and I said, "Where in the world did you ever find that out?" He said, "Well, right here." And admire my father much more on that day. He was a great teacher. And other things, I have occasion to worry about a bit by personal choice about middle school science education. And I took it upon myself to look up various terms in some middle school textbooks. And one of those in physics is the definition of temperature. I guess you could call that something that pervades science, but at least the physicists like to grab onto these things in terms of energy and heat. and so on. And almost universally in physics sections of middle school science books, the definition of temperature is, I don't know, anybody think they know what the definition of temperature in terms of middle school children would be? The average kinetic energy of gaseous molecules. Now, what an operational definition that is. I don't know how a middle school student is supposed to grab that and use it in the laboratory, for example, or even have some idea of how that would impact upon his or her life. Some other definitions, the measure of the degree of hotness of an object. It's a little closer to an operational definition, and I think it's one that's used in the university quite a bit too. Or one might say that it's a measure of whether or not heat will flow. Heat flows from an object which is hot at a higher temperature to an object which is cold at a low temperature. I like the definition that temperature is what you read on the thermometer. And I think that's probably as operational as you can get, and it's probably as close to the truth as you can get. And so I began to look around a little bit into experiments which look at temperature in terms of middle school education. And there's a neat demonstration that you ask the kids to do, and that is you get a metallic object like a file cabinet and a wooden object like a desk, and you say put one hand on the file cabinet and the other hand on the desk and tell me which is at the higher or lower temperature. And obviously the desk feels warm and the filing cabinet feels cold, and so the children will say that the filing cabinet has a lower temperature than the desk. And if you think about it, that's almost consistent with some of the definitions that they get. And we've been worrying today about misconceptions that students bring to our classroom. And I think we should worry also then about how we convey knowledge to them and how we allow them to relate that knowledge to everyday experience. Now, this gives you an opportunity to talk not only about temperature, but heat flow and heat capacity and all of those other nice things. But in essence, there is a misconception based on their own observations, their own way of looking at the universe. And it's those kind, I think, of misconceptions that we have problems with when we have students coming in to science class, because they're very straightforward and very simple in our mind. Another well-known experiment that gets carried out, and Noni, you've tried it in your laboratory school, is to take a piece of cloth, say a piece of nylon, a piece of cotton, and a piece of wool, and wrap a thermometer up with these pieces of cloth. Set them out and say, we're going to come back tomorrow and we're going to look at the temperature of these thermometers. Would you predict what those temperatures will be? And invariably the student will say that the thermometer that's wrapped in the wool cloth will be higher than the other thermometer. Because after all, when they wrap themselves in wool, they get hotter than when they wrap themselves in cotton and nylon. Now, you go back the next day, and of course the thermometers read the same. What is the student attitude towards that? Well, there must have been an obvious mistake in the experiment. That there was a gust of wind that came in the door and cooled down the thermometer in the wool, or warmed up the thermometer in the nylon or cotton. So you put it in a bag and you put it inside the drawer and so on, and then you help the student along by saying, well, we'll accommodate your ideas of what might have gone wrong here. We'll see if we can correct our experiment to do that. And day after day after day, the student comes back in and finds that the thermometer reads the same. Or perhaps the thermometers don't read the same by one reason or another. The student will not question the idea that the experiment has gone wrong on that day, but will immediately use that as an indication of their own misconceptions of what's going on in the situation. And those are the kinds of things that, again, the teacher is confronted with. Now, in this particular case, when this was first tried out, the teacher then said, all right, I'm going to give you some choices. How would you answer these? For example, heat is generated by certain objects, such as the sun or your body. Or Heat is generated by certain objects, such as the wool cloth or the cotton cloth. Which answer would you choose? Well, the class was normally pretty much divided one way or another. And no matter what the teacher said, the students would not change their minds. And the experiment, as far as I know, ended at that point. There was no way that a conviction could be made that was different from the one that the student came in. They would not change their mind. Those preconceptions are very strong. Now, Noni tried this out with 25 science teachers. And almost invariably, the answers were the same as the ones the students gave. So these are misconceptions that we continue to carry with us. This baggage goes along with us throughout our lives. And the challenge to the teacher, which is quite a great one, is how do I change this? And sometimes you just can't. You have to suddenly stand there and shout and say, "No, it's this way," and let it go at that. One thing that I've tried, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, if I have time, Ronnie, do I? Not much. And that is the use of modeling. Now, Art, you'll be happy with that idea. The use of modeling in teaching these sorts of things. And the model that I am proposing here is a model that I have suggested to the College Board to use in their Pacesetter courses, which are trying to integrate various aspects of science, and they have a course they want to call Heat and Energy. And the model I want to present is a garbage can full of water, a good model for a human being. Now, under certain circumstances. And so you have to explore the circumstances. And the circumstances I'm trying to get to is homeostasis, for example. What would it take in terms of energy input to have that can full of water maintain a constant temperature, a certain number of degrees above ambient temperature? Now, if you do that, and you're lucky, and you know how much water to put in the tank and so on, remember, this is a cylindrical object, more or less, and it is governed as far as its heat transfer is concerned by the surface area, which is pretty close to ours. I'm pretty much a cylinder here. And you can, by one way or another, measure the amount of heat that it takes to put into the system. Knowing the heat capacity, you can calculate all kinds of little things, one of which is, does that amount of heat have anything to say about the basal metabolic rate of human being? And it comes very close. So you can say, aha, most of our basal metabolic rate then, our energy input, is simply required to keep our body temperature constant. And you can launch into a lot of ideas about biology then, which normally came up here in any physics course. So I think the use of models, if carefully chosen, can introduce some very exciting concepts from the point of view of both the laboratory process experience for the kids and the introduction of a lot of conceptual information. So I guess I'm out of time. Thank you.
What I found today very stimulating. I've been really excited about the lectures that we've had so far, and have picked up a number of points that I'd like to comment on, but I thought maybe I should first of all give a sequel to Ron's discussion about the 3 thermometers, which we did do with the teachers, and we did convince some of the teachers that in fact heat conduction and heat production, well, production and insulation were 2 different things. And so one of the teachers got real excited, was going to do this with her students. So she went in Monday morning, it was January, and she went into the classroom and they put thermometers into 3 different socks, a wool sock, an nylon sock, and a cotton sock. And then at the end of the class, which was an hour and a half later, they looked at the thermometers. And she was just, she knew that those are going to be the same temperature. The kids had all predicted that they were going to be different temperatures. Well, they pulled out the thermometers, and the wool sock said 58 degrees, and the cotton sock said 62 degrees, and the nylon sock said 64 degrees. And she was horrified. She totally dropped it. She ran out. She said, I tried this at home. It worked, and I got it. I tried it in the class. It didn't work. You've given me the wrong thing. Well, I think any of you could, so I said, well, what was the situation in the class when we went in and so forth. And maybe you ought to try this again with the kids tomorrow. Obviously, what happened was that Monday morning it had been a really cold weekend, and the room was cold, and the room warmed up during the time, the hour and a half that they were there, so that the sock that had less insulation warmed up somewhat, whereas the sock that was insulated stayed cold. It totally blew her mind. But this leads into that we have teachers out there in the K-8 situation who are trying to do the things that Lillian was talking about and are trying to give hands-on experiences to kids that give them, looks at specific concepts and limit those concepts and build on those. And I've been real impressed with how the teachers are trying to make this tremendous shift. Because most of them they're middle school science teachers, but most of them are like the undergraduates who are not science majors because they've had, in most schools, education courses, or they don't get the science content. And so it's like the students that you have. And I find one of the important things that you kept mentioning was working in groups. That it's real important for these teachers to work in groups and to be able to support each other. But in this group, another thing that I find real important is to have a variety of skills coming into the group. And that is one place, if any of you have any concern about our public education or our pre-K, our pre-college education, you can get involved with these teachers. And I'd like to say John Freeman came last year and gave a talk to these teachers that are working in the model lab. As I said, they're middle school science teachers. And he happened to mention that there was going to be space on a shuttle that, in fact, flew this past January, that might allow a student experiment to go up. And so he related his information. He gave them some good science content, but then related to the things in the classroom. The teachers responded to that. And then we're able to pick up on this little suggestion that he made. And one of the teachers went running with it then and did, in fact, send an experiment, a student experiment, up on the shuttle. And John was real disappointed because he had thought that it was going to have electricity, it was going to be, that they could really do something significant. It turned out that it meant they could have a little black box that was just attached to the strut of the wake shield that went up. And which is really limited what you can do. But the teachers, because of John, knew about this possibility and weren't going to let it go. So they did a modification of the tomato seeds in space. I don't know if any of you know about that, where they sent up all these tomato seeds and gave them to teachers. And there were no results because they were grown in all different situations, and tomatoes take a long time to grow and so forth. But these teachers sent up seeds and pollen, so pollen presumably might be affected more than the seeds, of something called the Wisconsin fast plant, which is like the Drosophila in the plant world. It has an entire life cycle of 36 days, so that when they came back, they could do multiple generations. They could grow it in controlled conditions in the classroom. And so they got into a lot of botany. They got into genetics, preparing for this class. Students came in after school to grow the plants, to get the seeds, to send up on this shuttle. Some of the kids that were involved in this, because it was going in the shuttle, were kids that had failed science before. This grabbed hold of these kids that had no interest in science or any academics before. And they did get their seeds packaged. They were put on the wake shield. Then, in fact, when it was going to be launched, Continental paid for 8 students to go to Cape Canaveral to see it launched. Some of those kids had never been on a plane before. These are inner city kids. I mean, the impact was tremendous. The seeds are now back. They have grown control seeds that didn't go up, are now fairly tall. It's only been, let's see, they've only been growing 10 days so far. The seeds that were sent up in space were not killed. They did germinate, but they're just teeny, teeny, weensy things flat on the surface of the soil. They have not grown at all like the control seats. And so now the students are all excited, look, our seats made, there was a difference there, and they're going off to, was it because of heat, was it because of cold, was it because of the radiation? And these kids who have never had any interest in science before are now doing all sorts of exciting things because John Freeman came and talked to the teachers. And the teachers and John together got things going because group interaction is so important. And so I would like to welcome any of the rest of you who are interested. You don't have to suggest going off into space, but there's so much interesting science that our teachers have been taught previously the definitions in the book. And you people know what are the important concepts that they ought to be focusing on if they have to select down to a few things that Mr. Rutherford was telling us about. They don't know how to select because they don't know the overview. You can help them see what's important and what's not. So I'm real excited about what we're hearing today, and I want to thank all of you for speaking so to us.
Peter Nordlander. So there is really very little to add from the excellent presentation by Dr. Schwarzer. I've been involved in a similar development of a course, science for non-scientists. And so I'm going to give you some of my thoughts about that and try to complement your talk a little bit in some sense. First of all, I think the goal of this, and at least in my opinion, the ambition that I had and that was reasonably successful, was not really to teach the issues of physics, the technical details. I saw it as a challenge to try to teach scientific reasoning. This is something that isn't really obvious in humanities, in some, at least for students coming in. That in fact, what scientists does is they pick out some kind of reality. They try to look at the extremes of that sense of reality and try to devise an experiment in which some particular aspects can give a clue to what's going on. So that was really the nucleus of my course. I wanted to design something that really would teach the students scientific reasoning. The way I built up the course, it was in some sense arbitrary. I designed the course around 8 what I considered very fundamental experiments that had brought forward science sort of over a period of 400 years, starting with the Galileo experiment, the stone falling from the tilted tower, and then they ended with basically Michel's on Morley's experiments, which relativity comes in. And I tried to make a story of that. I tried to, I told the students at the outset that in order to pass this course, they had to know exactly how the experiment was done, why it was done, and what it led to. Some of these experiments we actually could do in the classroom. For instance, the Galileo experiment, that was sort of what we started out with in the beginning of the course, where students actually go in and they measure, well, as you know, the laser is here, that's an object, falling object, obtain its velocity instantaneously, or sort of is it that being accelerated. And we had a wild circus in the classroom, with chronographs and very, very interesting dialogue with the students and, of course, between me. And then, of course, in trying to make sense out of that, we needed to display data, draw plots, make graphs, etc. And I find the students got really excited about that, and that first sort of hands-on and experiments by these people really motivated them for the rest of the course. Some of the experiments we couldn't really, like this is a model experiment, we couldn't do in the classroom, but sort of having done some of the first experiments, sort of at least made the students very, very interested in understanding these kind of things. My experience in doing such a course is that, at least for me, it was really crucial to have a very small class. Okay? In these cases, the class was never bigger than 12 students. And And having a small class such as that really lets the student, makes the students more secure in asking questions. And my basic approach here is that what you want to do as a teacher is really to make the students interested in the subject, and make the students sufficiently interested to start thinking about it and go to the sources themselves, rather than just writing down what I tell them. I think the key to success in such a course is a small class size, so small that the students feel comfortable asking you a question. Is another very important issue too here is like what Dr. Schwartz brought out, to try to bring in some new concepts. Nuclear, in fact, I also talk about nuclear power, and this is something that really captivates students' attention and really gets them interested. Perhaps the most, at least in the 3 years I taught the class, the most interest, what students interest the most was lasers. We are very fortunate, for instance, here at Rice to have several very advanced laser labs, and I simply asked various professors and various laboratories on campus whether we could come and make a study visits. And for students to come in, for non-science students to come into a modern lab where there are vacuum pumps, vacuum chambers, and then laser beams zapping all over the lab. It was almost impossible to get them out. And they were so interested. And in fact, you can also explain in relatively simple terms the action of a laser. And I think it's very important to in spite of what I said in the beginning, that the aim of the course, I think, should be teach scientific reasoning. It's important to bring in some up-to-date phenomena such as nuclear power and lasers, for instance. These laboratory visits were, I got the impression they were also important for the students in the sense that they heard that they saw that I was not seeing the scientists, that they got to see that other scientists, in fact, would explain experiments. Scientists were not as weird as perhaps they are led to believe, yes. Okay, I think that should stop here.
And despite that, of course, I think science is wonderful. I'm a layman who's interested in science. But I have told some of you this story, but I now see it in a new light. I originally thought of it as a story about expertise. I now understand it's the teaching of science. I'll compress it because I have a couple of other stories I want to tell that I think are more relevant. But this story involves when I was, for a while, a chemical engineer, and I went to a pilot plant where I was assigned work. And this fellow was extruding plastic through a machine. And the plastic coil that came off of a runoff valve, and I used the chlorine coil. So I, knowing the ways of science, there I thought, went to this guy and said, "You see the way that coils? Isn't that interesting? That's the Coriolis force. If you were in this other hemisphere, it would coil the other way." So the guy spit on the floor, he slapped the plastic, and coiled the other way. Failure number one. There's a significant gap between theory and practice. This is what got me into a career in computer science. One gets a lot of debugging of concepts and can work kind of incrementally towards some understanding of something. But I had another chance to teach science where I failed again. My eldest daughter, despite my determination that she would love science, turned out to show not the slightest interest in science. None, as far as I can tell. Except, well, I have 3 daughters. I have 2 still, there's a question mark, but this old one now is 25, so she's gone to science. She's an anthropologist, so I guess that's sort of a science. I mean, it's one of these malleable sciences. But she's nonetheless on her own. My younger ones, they're 10 and 6, are they're experimentalists. You know, children are experimentalists. This business of you don't need to bring them into the classroom to drop things. They start by saying, geez, I wonder if I drop this, does it fall the same way if I drop, you know, the pudding? I thought, well, I better do that again. There's a determined experimentalism in children that gets lost. And Marvin Minsky was one of my faculty advisors when I was in graduate school. He used to say, people think that, you know, there's this thing called common sense. It's scientific knowledge that children have developed with years of experimentation. And it's ludicrous to pass it off as though they just, you know, sort of came to think for nothing. They worked hard to learn this stuff. And somehow, of course, I guess you all know that it's hard to sustain that apparently in school, that kind of experimentalism. But another way that I think is interesting, as I was listening to these talks, I was struck by this notion of the physical world and science speaking to the question of who am I? Because it seems to me that's the major bridge to cross over. If people can relate the understanding of science in some way to who am I really, that is really important. And I would like to say that I think that's an easy task, but I don't think it is. I teach, when I teach, artificial intelligence kinds of classes at Rice. And I'll tell you one other story because it's a real puzzle to me. Students in my class are typically very bright students. There are about as many as there are here, maybe fewer. They're typical Rice students in their senior years or some graduate students. And they are there presumably to wrestle with the question of whether it's possible to create intelligence that is in some sense disembodied. And so I went to tell them a kid's story. I have lots of kids' stories. And the kids' stories are fun. These students have been through this whole business about how you represent knowledge in the machine, and you know all you have to do is have this. And they have this kind of optimism of a funny sort. That all you do is in some way you put the stuff in the computer and eventually it acts like a person. And, you know, which I find very interesting in light of the question of what all this has to do with who I am. So anyway, my daughter had a wart. And she pinched her finger in the door, and a wart started growing where this pinch was, and then it became 2 warts. And we looked at it for a while, and then we blasted it with this awful thing called compound W. And the wart simply turned black. It didn't get any smaller, and it just got. And my daughter was really embarrassed. She would go around holding her hand. She was about 5 at the time. She would go around holding her hand like this. So I had read that you can cure warts, if you're lucky, through hypnosis. So I said to my daughter, well, you know, we tried science. Sorry to tell you this. We tried science and technology, but now we have to try magic. And she thought that was a really interesting approach. And so we traced her hand on a piece of paper, and then we put a red X through this place where the wart was. We folded it up. We sneaked over to the fireplace. We threw the piece of paper into the fireplace, and we promised, I'm sorry, I said we would never tell anybody about this. And up the chimney went the smoke, and 3 days later the warts were gone. Now I went to my class in artificial intelligence, and I told them the story, and I asked them what they made of it. I'm not going to ask you, I mean, we have a lot of time, I'm going to ask you what you make of it. But I asked them what they made of it. Now these are computer science students typically, and what do you think they made of it? Nothing. Nothing. I mean, they didn't ask questions, they didn't hypothesize, it wasn't artificial intelligence, it was just a story. They had so balkanized their knowledge that this is computer science 440, and this is irrelevant. I'm perhaps being extreme here. I asked them what they thought when Dylan Thomas talked about the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. What does that And does it have any relevance? It doesn't have. So I think one of the problems in teaching about science is the problem about teaching about anything, which is kids start to balkanize their knowledge. They start to say, this isn't in my domain. And my girls are starting to do that. I see it. I mean, I've got my heels dug in, and it's not because, I mean, maybe because they're girls, and maybe because they're macho, but it's fundamentally because they're told, this is a period, this is the class, this is the subject. And they don't understand this question that science is about. Who am I? I think it's a really major challenge, and I'm sorry I don't have a great answer for this, but it strikes me that the question of who am I is the place to start teaching science to people who are not scientists, and scientists as well. But most scientists seem to have a sense for the relevance, but the rest of the children that I see don't have this bridge. So anyway, that's my remark.
Okay, as is not unsurprising, we have a time problem. Nature of the beast. We have four panelists who've given us their insight, contributions to the subject at hand, sometimes commenting on the speakers, sometimes not. But be that as it may, it would be nice if we took a couple of questions. The coffee break is imminent. We'll only take a couple of questions, I think, because the next speaker is supposed to speak at 3:40, and if we don't have coffee this afternoon, we will not survive. So I'd like to take a couple of questions. Dan?
I'd like to address the question to Professor Forrest. The kind of course that you teach sounds marvelous. I wish I could have done the same in my science classes. I'm unsure, though, of exactly what you expected your students to take away from this in the long term, whether or not you think they did take anything away. You're probably familiar with studies that indicate that students will speak all of this sort of class years later even, but haven't the foggiest notion of what they did, or why, or what happened. Should you offer some insight and observation to that?
Very good question. Well, one thing I didn't expect them to take away was any serious knowledge about science. And I think that that's just, frankly, pretty hopeless. Most people, I think, feel an introductory course like this, people will not take it away and remember how to solve the problems at the end of the chapter. So what then did I hope? I hope that they form some attitudes, get some awareness, maybe not quite run away when these things were mentioned and say, I have any clue, because maybe they didn't have some clue. I was very interested in this question of who am I and where do I belong. I thought it might help their general Weltanschauung, in ways that they weren't even aware of. I really don't believe in the idea of total quality management of education. And I don't believe very much in testing and outcomes assessment. Every person is different, and intelligence is so multidimensional. I think all we can do is just try to give people something, and I don't even claim to know about it.
I'd like to make a comment. Years ago, I taught a course at Rice with a colleague, Carl Leskov, and we called it The Role of Mathematics in Civilization. We taught it 5 or 6 times. And we had 2 goals in that. One was to describe what kind of geometry describes our universe and what kind of computational ability can you use this geometry to get around, in some sense. We asked that. We had 2 questions, and we asked it from the historical point of view, starting with the Egyptians, Babylonians, all the way up to Einstein. And so
distinguished engineer said, well, it keeps my coffee hot in the wintertime, and it keeps my iced tea cold in the summertime. Because the distinguished engineer said, how does it know which to do?
Good story. I think with that, it's time for coffee. The Rice Memorial, invite everyone to visit about 5:30, short walk down the way after the formal conference is over. This afternoon, our speaker is John Lienhard from the University of Houston. He is the M.D. Anderson Professor of Mechanical Engineering and History at the University of Houston, and is a voice I've heard on National Public Radio broadcast many times in the afternoon, sometimes early in the mornings as I drive around the city of Houston, in his wonderful set of broadcasts, The Engines of Ingenuity. He is a expert in the area of mechanical engineering with degrees from Oregon State, University of Washington, and Berkeley, and his research relates to heat transfer, phase changes, dynamics, and more recently, perhaps forever, history of technology. His publications include some 4 books, some 300 journal and article publications, and 920 episodes of Engines of Our Ingenuity as of the 21st of March, 1994, as he said, I read, because that continues to grow. And for those of you who have not heard that, I recognize that you do. In his abstract, he tells us that 3/4 of the world learns by looking outside, and 1/4 of the world searches our own minds. This is a dichotomy, and one of the things that he'd like to do today is to explore this dichotomy with the hope of giving us new insights on learning. And I present to you Dr. John Lienhard, who will present the title of the book, lecture, Making the Familiar Strange, Reflections on the Origins of Creativity.
It is a great pleasure to be here for this exciting meeting that's going on today. I do suppose that I can't let go of this temperature thing. One of the great horrors of my life is teaching heat transfer and getting up there and telling the class about when I was a kid in Minnesota. You know, it got very cold in Minnesota. I mean, it got really cold. I mean, it would get so cold, you go out on the back porch with a cup of hot coffee, and that coffee would freeze. I mean, it would freeze fast. It would freeze so fast, it would still be hot after it. And you see the students' pencils moving. Well, let's talk about 3 avenues by which ideas reach us. We observe an objective external reality. We create knowledge by gazing on internal realities in our mind's eye. And the third is hardest. It is to combine those 2 eyes. To do that, I believe, we have to reclaim a child's ability to use both eyes at once. And that's where I'm headed today. In the late 1500s, a young Italian boy took up the study of art. He was Galilei, and that background in art really helped to define Galileo. And yet, all his life, Galileo talked like a Platonist. He expressed the belief that understanding comes from within. Aristotle, of course, taught us to observe nature and make scientific inferences from observations. He really set up the modern scientific method. Plato, on the other hand, believed we could arrive at scientific understanding through purely mental processes. For example, Platonic Greeks used deduction to decide that the world was round. All heavenly bodies are round. The sun is round. The moon is round. We swim in the same firmament. We must also be round. Aristotle got to the same conclusion, but he got there by generalizing direct observation. He watched ships sailing off to the horizon. The bottoms vanished first and the sails vanished last, and that meant that the curvature of Earth obstructed more and more of the boat as it got further and further away. Therefore, Earth must be round. Now, if you read Galileo's description of how he dropped balls from the Tower of Pisa to learn how bodies fall, he seems to be describing an experiment not done in real life, but a thought experiment done only within his own head. He talks like a Platonist. Yet we know Galileo looked closely at the external world for understanding. There are details in his Tower of Pisa experiment that no one, or I should say his Tower of Pisa argument, that no one could have imagined without actually having done the experiment. He really did that experiment. He did many more as well. He talked like a Platonist, but he behaved like an Aristotelian. And he gave us a wonderful phrase. It was he who I believe first spoke of seeing with the eye of the forehead and or with the eye of the mind. And that's what I want to talk about. Science education is torn by this same dialectic tension. To which eye do we speak? And how do we engage that eye? Maybe some of you have taken the Myers-Briggs personality test. If you have, you know how it describes us according to how we seek out and deal with information. One piece of that test is what they call the sensate intuitive indicator. Some of us are sensate Aristotelians who look to the external world for knowledge. Some of us are intuitive Platonists who look inside our own heads for knowledge. Now, it turns out that, at least by the Myers-Briggs instrument, 75% of our population is more Aristotelian than Platonist. And that is a terribly important number for us. Most people immediately assume that the external world is what teaching is all about. That teaching is little more than reporting external reality to students. Art and science museums offer a powerful analogy to the problem I pose. And let me say something about that particular teaching function. I offer you Turner's marvelous painting, Rain, Steam, and Speed. You see the merest hint of a locomotive far ahead of its time, surging through bitter weather on the merest ghost of a bridge. To the Aristotelian majority, that picture shows what a train might look like in foul weather. But the picture bothered Aristotelian viewers in 1840. Trains didn't really look like that, not yet in 1840. The painting worked a wholly different magic in the Platonic mind of the Romantics. We see the storm within us as we create nature within our own heads. We hear King Lear, blow winds and crack your cheeks, you cataracts and hurricanes spout, you sulphurous fires and oak-cleaving thunderbolts. Back in 1911, American artists fought this Platonist Aristotelian combat in a very dramatic way. That year, 16 young artists formed the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, the AAPS. The artistic world was in revolution, and the powerful National Academy of Design, dictator of American tastes, was trying to ignore it. Oh, don't worry about that. The Academy of Design was the dictator of American tastes, and they were simply trying to ignore the revolution that was in motion. The young artists of the AAPS meant to change that, and their first order of business was to exhibit the new art, to show what artists were really doing. But where to mount such a show? Madison Square Garden was too small, and then one member said, let's rent an armory. That was a stroke of both genius and irony. For half a century, big American cities had built wild, fanciful armories in the style of medieval castles. We were afraid of the Union movement, and so we made those architectural dinosaurs to house troops in the middle of cities so we could control growing worker unrest. Now, the AAPS artists rented the 69th Regimental Headquarters of the New York National Guard for $5,000. It was gloomy, menacing old Gothic building, but it had huge floor space. Into that space went the art of the late Impressionists and the first moderns. Van Gogh, Braque, Cassatt, Seurat, Munch, Matisse, Picasso, Bellows. Rank on rank, the great art of the age poured in from Europe and America. The exhibit opened to 4,000 people on February 17, 1913. The papers made news of it any way they could. They ridiculed the art, but no matter. The public had seen it, and they understood. Just as the exhibit closed, 1,200 striking workers marched into New York from Paterson, New Jersey. They'd been organized by the same members of the intelligentsia who backed the Armory Art Show in the first place. The revolutionary connection was quite explicit. Our world was going to be changed. There was no shaking off this new vision of the human condition. Artists like Georgia O'Keeffe went back to reinvent their art. Duchamp's cinematic cubist painting of a nude descending a staircase was the star of the show. A buyer made off with it for $324, by the way. The AAPS didn't survive the exhibit, but then it didn't have to. The intensity of this gathering, the counterpoint, revolution housed in that counter-revolutionary armory, it gave us new eyes. The art may look tame today, but in 1913 it changed us, and it did something more. It opened our atrophied, underused Platonic eye. People looked at that nude coming down the staircase and said at first, I see neither a nude nor a staircase. Then they looked again. This time maybe they asked the question, how would I respond to a nude suddenly regally appearing upon the staircase at a formal ball? How would that stunned sequence of freeze frames imprint itself upon my mind? How would I recreate such a violation of normalcy in my mind after I'd seen it? I guess what touches me about that moment in history, that Armory Art Show, is the lack of any intermediary. Never mind the building, never mind the exegesis, never mind the faculty members standing up and telling us about it. There was all that art, just the art, raw and unprocessed, and it acted directly upon the eye of the public. First upon the common Aristotelian eye, then upon the shy Platonic eye, the eye of the soul. Let me bring that idea back to the present. In January, I was up in Boston. I visited Harvard's Natural History Museum. At the desk, I asked the docent about the exhibits, and while we spoke in the hushed voice that you reserve for places filled with mystery, suddenly 30 noisy school kids burst up the stairs. Start in the back wing, the lady said to me. The children will be gone by the time you finish there. So I thanked her, and when she wasn't looking, I turned and I followed the children into the Museum of Comparative Zoology. That wing had its origins in the mid-19th century. It was like my childhood museums. It's also one of the finest such collections in the world. It is an eerie jumble of bones, fossils, stuffed animals. The bones go far beyond the usual Brontosaurus or Tyrannosaurus. I saw Paleolithic mammals from Australia and South America, wild, improbable beasts. Somebody seemed to have stirred mastodons, horses, and saber-toothed tigers all together into some strange animal soup. One case holds the skeleton of some antediluvian swimming beast, 30 feet long with a 5-foot fanged jaw. In the next wing came case after case of every beast and bird on the planet, stuffed and ready to eat you. I followed the children. A few boys stopped and randomly poked buttons on one of the electronic displays that's now a required part of every modern science museum. They poked and wandered on. Those video screens were out of place. I suppose somebody installed them because that's what you do in modern museums. I watched the children following their teachers past the cases of animals and bones, tugging at their coats. Hey, Mrs. Brent, look at this. The children were enchanted by three-dimensional beasts, no computer screen image, no menu of canned questions. These children created their own question. Could I have petted this thunder lizard, or would he have swallowed me in one go? How fast did he run? Did he sleep standing up? What did those bones look like when they still wore flesh? At last the children swirled down the iron staircase, sated with wonders and buoyant with questions of their own making. They taught me a new lesson in an odd place about learning, and I savored the lesson as the holy quiet descended once more, punctuated only by the hiss of outdated steam radiators. On the airplane back to Houston, an eerie thing happened to me. I sat typing a radio episode about the museum on my laptop computer while my wife read Natural History magazine. Suddenly she said, "John, look at this." It was an article by Stephen Jay Gould called Cabinet Museums Revisited. Gould tells about his visit to the venerable Museum of Natural History in Dublin. He moved through its cluttered cases, kept in pristine 19th century conditions, and recited the names of the Irish naturalists who'd been touched by its exhibits when they were children. Interactive museums have their place in this TV-driven world, Gould said, but this is another kind of experience. We should not rob our children of this experience. And so who is Gould? Well, of course, he's the curator of that Harvard museum that had just touched me so powerfully. That was one museum. Now let me tell you about another quite different museum that I saw in Sydney, Australia in the summer of 1991. I left the meeting one afternoon and went to visit their highly touted state-of-the-art science museum. It was thoroughly modern. It was a hands-on exploratorium for school children. Here and there, mimes did little theater pieces. It offered children the same experiments that I'd done in physics as a college freshman. Turn a knob and measure gravity, or the period of a pendulum. Place a ball in a stream of air and learn Bernoulli's principle. It was also sensible and user-friendly. Here, I also watched the children. They ran about randomly throwing balls and pulling levers. All they saw was motion. Meanwhile, their unrewarded excitement was driving them to a fever pitch of chaos. I watched their frustrated exuberance and remembered my own visits to the museum. Mine was quiet and mysterious, a little like the Harvard Museum. It too was a cabinet museum. I didn't understand everything there either. I didn't understand, but I knew it held secrets that I must one day learn. I knew the force ran in that place, filled with skulls and sarcophaguses and minerals. Those old buildings once told me the mysterious power of knowledge. We tiptoed and whispered as much as to honor that presence as to avoid disturbing each other. Children and adults alike knew that instinctively, and that indeed is what Steve Schwartz has just told us about in the observatory in California, that sense that transcended the buttons. What we want to do all we can to make knowledge accessible, but the ancient lore of our people is precious, and it all has eerie Platonic dimensions to it. If we forget that, the learning process will have nothing to feed upon. It will become very empty indeed. It all seems so obvious in retrospect, but we forget. The Smithsonian Institution used to be an exciting place. Now, over the past 10 or 15 years, it grows dull. The Smithsonian tries to do what Disney World does much better. Once upon a time, you could buy books in their bookstore. Now you buy t-shirts and plastic dinosaurs. A move is afoot in modern museums everywhere. They're determined to speak more and more to the Aristotelian eye, which is our dominant adult eye. And I see them trying to speak to that adult eye in children. That is a profound miscalculation. That is not the way children think. Let's think for a moment about the child's eye. Children have so much to tell us. Children are, to begin with, far more creative than most of us remember how to be. That's precisely because they view a world unformed by experience. Everything is new. Everything is still strange. Everything is fraught with possibility. It's no accident that our discussers have returned to children again and again, and our speakers have returned to children again and again. It's no accident. The Montessori people try very hard to capitalize on this child's eye. However, at the same time, they tiptoe through the matter of fantasy versus reality in a way that worries me. Maria Montessori was a complex, intriguing woman. She herself was a child prodigy in mathematics. She was willful and hard-headed in achieving her ends. Jerome Berryman, one of her biographers, tells a curious story about Montessori. It's a story that helps me understand her better. A colleague found her sobbing in her pew at the Church of Our Lady of Pompeii on Christmas Eve, 1916. After Mass, they talked, and what Montessori said to her was, "They think I'm a sentimental romantic who dreams only of seeing children, kissing them, telling them fairy tales. They weary me. I seek to discover the man in the child, to see in him the true human spirit, the design of the Creator, the scientific and religious truth. It is to this end that I apply my method of study, which respects human nature. I don't need to teach anything to children. It is they who, placed in a favorable environment, teach me, reveal to me spiritual secrets, as long as their souls have not been formed." Well, there's a lot of content in that outburst. We catch the intensity of the woman. Of course, that crack about deformed souls reveals something else about Montessori. Montessori forced her success by eliminating failure. She not only got rid of kids who didn't harmonize with her classroom, she even eliminated whole families of troublesome parents. Still, she ran on powerful imperatives, and she was sure in her bones that the teacher has as much to gain in the school as the child does. The teacher realizes that gain by gazing at the world through the child's eyes, and that was a profound and religious conviction for Montessori. The famous child psychologist Jean Piaget also knew that we learn from children. He went to children to learn how we learn. For example, he handed children a bicycle and asked them how it worked. And I want you, as I do this, to listen to the similarity with some of Tony Gory's remarks, which really echo this. Their answers help us to see more specifically what we have to learn from our young. He begins with 4-year-olds. They see the bicycle as a whole, a thing that goes entirely of itself. Listen to this dialogue between psychologist and child. The psychologist says, "How does the bicycle go?" "With wheels." "And how do the wheels turn?" "The bicycle makes them turn." "How?" "With the handlebar." "And how does the handlebar make the bicycle go?" "With the wheels." And what makes the wheels turn?" "The bicycle." And so forth. Children draw parts into the explanation, and they drop them just as quickly, for the bike is entire unto itself. When children are closer to 6, they start referring to the parts, but not in any orderly cause and effect way. You hear things like, "What makes the chain turn?" "The wheels." "And what makes the wheels turn?" "Those brake wires." As a child approaches 8, he starts using cause and effect sequences that pass from one part to another, but he has trouble getting them right. The feet turn the pedals, and they drive the chain, and it turns the sprocket, which drives the wheel, but he's not quite sure what turning the handlebar has to do with propelling the bike. Only around 9 can most children sketch a bike from memory and explain how the parts work. It's a lesson for all of us, surrounded as we are by so many machines we don't understand. Suppose you ask a person how his computer works. He might answer, "You turn it on." "What does it do?" "It writes letters, it does math." "What's that whirring sound?" "Well, that's its motor." "Well, what does it do?" "It helps figure out the answer." The machine we don't understand is a machine entire unto itself. Parts we don't understand aren't elements in a causal chain. They are only aspects of a functioning whole. Piaget's children and their bicycles tell us how we ourselves come to understand things. A peculiarity of Aristotelian thinking is that we analytically decompose things into cause and effect sequences. One thing Piaget does not say is profoundly important. At the last, we have to put the parts back together. We have to reclaim the child's view. The truest answer to the question, how does the bicycle work, is that we and the machine do become a single thing. Forget the wheels, the chain, and the sprocket. We simply sail down the road with the wind blowing through our hair. Children, in other words, begin in a Platonic world. They gradually learn the Aristotelian techniques of analytical decomposition. At length, you and I, we former children, have to learn all over again to see with the inner eye. Piaget shows us very dramatically that to understand a child's learning, we have to make the familiar bicycle strange in our own eyes. We must make it strange to us as it is to the child. Modern engineering designers are catching on to this. Take the Greek word synectics. It means binding different elements, and it fits invention. We invent when we see relations that other people have missed. An engineer, William Gordon, laid hold of the word synectics in 1961. He pointed out that putting 3 people in a room doesn't mean tripling their effect. 3 people with IQs of 100 are not apt to function like 1 person with an IQ of 300. You have to do more than put people in the same space to make them do what they are capable of doing. Since invention is subjective, our 3 designers have to learn to work together on a subjective, dare I say, confessional level. To see how this works, let's join a designer trying to improve his airplane altimeter. He opens it up and he looks inside and he begins free associating. I see 100 little gears, but that spring catches my eye. Nothing really matters with that spring, does it? But the spring, what does that spring feel like? I am the spring. I feel pushed and pulled. It's torture. It's tight in here. How can I free myself? I want to get rid of those gears. Why can't I speak straight to the die? He draws himself into the machine and he abstracts himself from it at the same time. He becomes the machine. He becomes the spring, and he finds the weakness of the machine. Suddenly he sees that gears have complicated the design. He throws most of them out. He puts a visible marker right on the spring itself to display the altitude directly. What he's really done is to make the familiar machine strange, very strange. Now, it's one thing to work this way alone, but we have to reinvent cooperation to do it in a group. That's just what Edison managed to do. He relied heavily on a group that functioned subjectively and cooperatively at the same time. He worked with people who learned to be vulnerable to new ideas and to trust each other at the same time. The synectics program was quite explicit about making the familiar strange. Gordon tells about a 19th century South Sea Islander looking at a 3-masted, 2-funneled steamer for the first time. He called it a 3 pieces bamboo, 2 pieces puff puff, walk along inside, no pants. Now enter the islander's mind, and you see the machine afresh. That's what we mean by making the familiar strange. And that's the way we gain new eyes to view a problem. Modern design is up to an odd business. We're learning to speak to that wild, intelligent child within us. That stereotype of technological detachment is as dead as it is misguided. Dead as it is misguided. Designing is a deeply personal act. It's powerfully exciting, and we really do have reason to look to children to learn how to do it. This morning, Noni described a marvelous question for 8th graders. She described it with some question in her mind. It involved redesigning ketchup. Think about that just a little bit. As long as ketchup is just an old, familiar ketchup, it is an empty and meaningless exercise. But make the ketchup strange in your own mind, and whole new worlds begin to open up. Is ketchup a taste, or a texture, or is it a cultural artifact? Remember Ogden Nash? The wondrous thing from the ketchup bottle, first a little, then a waffle. It is an exercise that will only serve us if we have that capability of making that. This morning, Lily McDermott gave us a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. I claim that what she did with that electric circuit was to first make the electric circuit strange in her own eyes so she could see it with the unmathematical innocence of a beginning student. Now, come from that back to Montessori for a moment. I have a small germ of trouble with Montessori. She strongly believed that we must keep our children's feet on the ground. And here's what she actually said to us. What we call creation is in reality a composition, a construction raised upon a primitive material of the mind which must be collected from the environment by means of the senses. Now, so far so good. But I get nervous when she goes one step further. She says, We are unable to imagine things which do not actually present themselves to our senses. That's called constructivism. Montessori's constructivism reaches a point that worries me. I wonder if the religious Montessori didn't deny the hand of God in our thoughts. She certainly regarded fantasy as disengagement from sense data, and for her, sense data was all important. Fantasy, and here we are back to your your warped question. Fantasy is dangerous, no doubt, but I believe we learn when we disengage from sense data. And so Montessori and I dance about a tight line that divides the wellspring of creativity and originality from madness. The simple fact is, if we only learn what we expect to learn, then we haven't learned anything at all. That's something children have been trying to tell us. How many children are driven away from schools by teachers who haven't understood that learning must contain surprise? Here again, that was a point that Stephen Schwartz also made just a moment ago in different words. The common sense of the external world is a center of gravity to which we return from our flights of fancy. But it is the idea that precedes expectation that makes science, technology, and invention such a delight. How many of you have ever read any of John Tyndall's work? How many of you have ever read John Tyndall? Thank you. Thank you. Surely, Mike, surely the smiling Irishman has been. Mike Carroll talked about the power of acoustics for telling students what science is. Well, the Irish Tyndall's 19th century book on acoustics was a masterpiece of science. Tyndall was one of the greatest of the great Victorian physicists. We remember the people who learned from him, people like Maxwell and Rayleigh, but we've practically forgotten Tyndall. I'm not surprised that very few of you know Tyndall. I'm not surprised. Tyndall was 34 in 1854, and that year he appeared in a London lecture hall talking about science education. Science, he said, begins with a question. To answer any question about nature, we must first observe, take in sense data, heat, light, sound. But then he goes on, listen to this, very, very wonderful line. We observe the fact but are not satisfied with observation. The fact must be accounted for. We transfer facts to the domain of thought, look at them, compare them, bring them ever clearer before the mental eye, and finally, we alight upon the cause which unites those facts. Tyndall came back to that elemental theme again and again. It was like a religious creed. We must move back and forth between an observed world and an invented world. It's never enough to observe, it's never enough to theorize. We must do both or we accomplish nothing. The unanswered question was for him where that synthesis began. 22 years later, an older John Tyndall gave another lecture. This time, he'd been in the wilds of northern Scotland, the craggy highlands that Walter Scott wrote about. And there, he encountered a mystery of Gothic proportion. He found a question all right. He'd seen the mysterious parallel roads of Glen Roy. Glen Roy is the valley of the River Roy in Scotland, and high on either side, you see three parallel roads winding along the canyon wall, only a stone's throw apart. Clearly, this was a question worth asking. Those remote, improbable roads had been there a long time before any account of it. But for the last 100 years, scholars had been scratching their heads and asking why three roads should have been made parallel with one another. Tyndall says this: we need two distinct mental processes to treat such a question. First, faithful observation of the data. Second, that higher mental process in which the constructive imagination comes into play, connecting separate facts with their common cause and weaving them into an organic whole. Tyndall asks us to begin with detached observation. Then we undertake the very personal process of inventing a theory. That's what Scottish country folk had done in their own way. They explained those crazy roads by saying their ancestors had made them as open areas to tempt game out of the brush into a vulnerable position. Then the scientists came. They said, wait a minute, those aren't roads at all. They're terraces formed by water levels in the valley. That's why their elevation doesn't vary. Well, that's all very fine. But how did the valley fill with water for long periods of time and then empty out? They finally saw how subsequent glaciers had dammed the outlet of the valley, and by the time they finally had it right, the great minds of the age had wrestled with those mad roads that weren't roads at all. Charles Darwin, Louis Agassiz, and Tyndall too. But this night, Tyndall hadn't come to the lecture hall to talk about the answer, even though he helped to find it. He wanted us to understand the process that begins with a small question about three crazy roads and ends with a new understanding of geology. What held Tyndall's heart was the joy of marrying the mind to external data. That essential act of modern science is laid bare in Tyndall's response to a child's question about eerie roads that weren't at all what they seemed to be. A question that could only be answered by making the familiar strange. Almost everything a child sees is surprise. That's exactly why children learn faster than we do. Farouk Mistry, who used to teach engineering design at UH, does a fascinating thing when he poses student design projects. He tells a fairy story about the mythical planet of Vayu. So, semester after semester, new problems have come up on Vayu. Each semester, he's asked his students to invent, design, and build a machine to solve that problem on the mythical planet of Vayu. Some people say, you're training engineers. Why don't you give them real-life problems to prepare them for real life? Wonderfully Aristotelian demand. The answer is basic to our conversation. The whole point is for students to become inventors. To do that, they have to shake free of practical realities, of what they already know. They have to learn to see around the corner. So we frame problems in a child's terms. Learning flourishes when we begin by making the familiar strange. We create better designers. We ultimately create better designs. Understand, you ask students to build actual machines to compete with other machines in the physical world. But to do that, we first remind them of that childlike ability they once had. We do that by posing the problem in childlike terms. And if we succeed, then the students make a natural reflex of such thinking. We teachers, you and I, are doing something far larger than teaching a mere body of knowledge. Oh, I grant you that a big piece of education is dealing in matters of objective fact. F equal ma, the formula for stress in a bent beam, the dates of the Upper Paleolithic period. That sort of stuff will and must flow in the classroom. But it will flow differently to each student. Another point that our speakers and discussants have made repeatedly here today. What we really accomplish, what we must accomplish in a classroom full of half-adult students is to recreate the atrophied child's mind. Before we talk to students, we ourselves must figure out how to preserve the child's ability to make the familiar strange. We ourselves must know how to invert our commonplace realities so we can find a new place to stand. Like a good museum, we must provide the raw material, Montessori's Aristotelian sense data, but like a good museum, we must give that eye of the mind something to feed upon. I want to put those materials in the students' hands. Our material, our body of sense data is powerful, but it's not much good until the eye of the mind learns to see it. Your Foucault Pendulum. My favorite item in any Texas museum is an early 14th century Madonna and Child in our Museum of Fine Arts. Maybe some of you know it. It's a 2/3 life-size statue in limestone from Normandy. It's a quiet thing with only traces of what was once bright pink. The mother wears a cheerful smile. She's so pleased with her child. And there's a goofy merriment on the Christ child's face that is infectious. That presence buoys me every time I pass it. I come away better knowing how to find God in the people around me, but I come away far better prepared to read about medieval attitudes and about medieval theology as well. That statue is, for me, what education has to be. It is hard information about medieval Europe, but it pries open my underused Platonic eye. It does what any good teacher does. I am a student. Help me to know once more what I knew long ago, before I analytically decomposed my bicycle, before I forgot what it felt like to ride my bike or Turner's mad locomotive on the winds of my imagination.
turned to me and she says, "How are you going to top that?" I said, "I'm not even going to try." There was so much in that, John. I really appreciate it. And I looked out on the sheet of paper in which I was writing my notes, and there weren't any. But it wasn't because you had nothing to say, it was because you mesmerized me, I think, frozen my hands. And I looked at Melanie, and she didn't have anything more than I did. So thank you very much. I did try to make some connections here. Obviously, I do have to have something to say. What I tried to do was to take your pictures and to think back over my own education and to identify those teachers in science who had influenced me and ask myself the questions at those particular ages. How and why did they influence me? And I think back to having moved into a new neighborhood to start attending 4th grade. And from 4th through 6th grade, lived there and had the same science teacher for all those years. And she wasn't just a science teacher. This was Cecilia Kraft was her name, actually. And Cecilia was about this tall and about that wide, lived with her brother on a farm, and they farmed the farm when she wasn't teaching. And when she was teaching, she taught me both science and art, which I think is segueing into what you had to say a little bit at least. And I learned to appreciate science through art, and art, as a matter of fact, through science. And it was a difficult decision in my own mind at that young age as to whether I would become an artist or a scientist. And I think I learned from Cecilia that there really wasn't any difference in the two in some respects. That you look at the world and you observe it and you internalize it and you come to conclusions. And some of those conclusions are artful conclusions and some are scientific, but they're both quite valid ways of looking at the world. I got through 6th grade and went to middle school. I love middle school. I walk into Linear Middle School and it smells like a middle school. And I keep telling people this. And I'm going to try someday to figure out how to test this. But I swear it all smells the same and it's all pheromones. It's rampant in these middle schools. And it hasn't changed over the years. And this brings me to my middle school science teacher, Miss Faith. The most beautiful woman I'd ever met in my life. And because of that, because of her, because of the way she was, and because of my rampant hormones, she inspired me into science. And in spite of myself, I had to listen to what she had to say because she mesmerized me also during those days, but for different reasons. I'm being quite truthful here with you. And when she became pregnant and finally had her baby and named it Ronald, that was it. There was no way I was going to do anything else but science. I got to high school, and this was during the 40s, the late 40s. And I think during that time, science was quite different in high school, or science education, at least. It was quite qualitative in my mind. I did not take chemistry in high school. I tutored chemistry instead because I thought the teacher was an idiot. I took the physics course and enjoyed it, but I didn't learn physics in the physics course, really. I learned something about physics, but I learned physics in the math courses. And I got to say that my best science teachers in high school were the math teachers. Now, interestingly enough, they were all coaches also. But somehow or other, they had learned enough math to impress me enough that I listened to what they had to say, and I thought I became quite good at math. And that sort of swung me quantitatively into perhaps the harder sciences, or the more solid sciences at those times. And I entered college with a math and chemistry background and decided to become a math and chemistry major. Although I look at my college experience, and I'll be darned if I can find anybody who really influenced me. I can't find them. Now that troubles me, and I don't quite know why. But I persevered anyway, and got to graduate school. And I have to identify my research director there as the great influence in my life. Because not only did my research director in graduate school demand that I learn the subject, but he demanded that I internalize the subject. And none of my graduate students, I sort of call that the Zen of science. You have to think like a rice plant in order to tell other people what a rice, or even to tell yourself that the rising plant does. This man gave that to me, although it was crystallography at that time, and I had to learn how to think like a molecule, or how to be a molecule. But I do really believe that you have to not only adopt a point of view to teach something, you have to become that point of view to teach something. And I try to do that at Rice, and I think I do succeed somewhat, but probably, again, only in the laboratory on a one-on-one basis with an individual graduate student did that ever happen. I can remember going to the chemistry introductory course, which Ronnie alluded to, in which some students survived. The year he took it was, I guess, my first year. And I came to Rice absolutely afraid of the students because I had heard that they were so good and that they had to really be challenged, otherwise they'd walk out of your classes and so forth. And my first exam, the mean was 34. And I tried to challenge them. And obviously I did. But Ronnie survived, and I'm not quite sure why, and I survived, and I did become somewhat, maybe not better, but at least more lenient in the way I approach the subject matter. Transferring that over into biology, I find that biology is a much different subject to teach than chemistry was in a lot of respects. People claim it's easier. Let me tell you, I go through, this is a darn survey course you talked about, I go through all 5 kingdoms in 9 days. Now, how do you go through all 5 kingdoms, everything that ever lived and ever will live, species differentiation and so on? You need a point of view, and the point of view, Joan, you might be interested, that I now have decided in my own mind is the one that I should use to teach the comparative zoology and physiology and whatnot of these 5 kingdoms, is that of evolution. And there is a thread along which you can place these different species, and along which you can compare these and make some sort of sense out of it. And I think for the first time since going into the biology department this year, I have succeeded in my own mind. I'm not sure the students agree with that, but I'm satisfied. But I must say, there are different ways of teaching science. It depends upon the situation you find it in. It depends upon how many students you're looking at. It depends upon their point of view. It depends upon how much you can internalize yourself and how much you can get the students to internalize. So I got to admit, it's been a long, hard process. And I haven't figured it out, but I want to share with you the people along the way who helped me and why at that particular time they did. Thank you.
Well, I'm real glad to hear your comment about ketchup because it's bothered me a great deal, and I didn't realize the wisdom of TEA in creating this ketchup problem and the art that was involved in it. And now I won't feel so upset when you see the school district's response was they have a full semester they can prepare the kids for the ketchup. And so the school district said, well, now don't spend a full semester just studying ketchup. Even with the bottles and the waddles, because then the kids will get tired of it and they won't have this creativity spark that you were talking about. And so the way to do that is to instead let them look at 3 bottles of mayonnaise and 3 bottles of mustard and 3 bottles of salsa. And so many of our schools that I have visited are spending at least 9 weeks preparing for the ketchup test, which maybe could be spending some other science instead, but now I realize that they're looking at the art. And,
I see the mystery.
in this other class this morning that we've heard about too, where they had this great teacher, but that he was so ineffective, they're only spending 2 weeks on it, because that's a gifted class. But in fact, and we do need to bring art into the way we teach science, and when we're teaching it also in the college level. And I do think that looking at Lillian McDermott in talking about being able to explain the ideas that we teach in our university classes in one's own words and being able to apply them into a new situation is a way of looking at what we're teaching that doesn't normally get analyzed in our classes. We're so used to giving them information and having them feed it back to us, and that's not all that it should be. So I really like her exhortations to us, and I want to suggest for you, even in your college classes, this book that he was talking about, Science for All Americans. It took 3 years to write, because what are the important concepts? We can't teach everything. The quantity is too great. And we may want to do the Socratic method like the law schools, but this gives us some guidelines maybe on what at least a group of people together working and decided were some themes that were important, since you can't cover all the factoids. And the themes of things like change over time, or evolution, or scale. They have, in fact, also gone into the benchmarks, which are then more specifics, how one could apply this in various grade levels. And I just really want to thank Rutherford for his vision in creating this system, which can help us cope with all of the science information that we need to teach on any grade level, from kindergarten through university or into graduate. And I'm really excited about this conference today, so that we can talk about different ways to approach the science education question, and how we can pass on information to the succeeding generations. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and for our speakers for all their wisdom.
There's really very little to say, but I want to catch up a little bit on the concept you introduced, and that's about teaching children. I mean, that's an absolutely perfect example of how teaching should be done. Because there we are dealing with a truly interactive situation, where the student, the child is able to ask questions and immediately get a response from the educator. The problem with this is that this is not a realistic way to pursue science teaching at university. I mean, in my opinion, we can approach it a little bit by moving towards small classes and developing a kind of intimacy in the class that sort of allows the student to, doesn't scare the student from asking questions. But it is, I don't think there's a surprise we look at children in terms of learning, but we should bear in mind that that's a very special situation that we cannot accomplish at the university. But it, of course, works great. I hope it's such a good talk. I really don't have anything more to say.
Well, I have one more child experimental story, because I was struck again with emphasis on children. Not all children's experiments are looked on with favor, of course. A friend of mine was horrified when one of his young scientists, child, and his friends discovered on a warm day in Houston, when the temperature gets really hot, if you pull Oreo cookies apart, they will stick to wallpaper. Now that's a perfectly reasonable experimental procedure. Those children were on their way to being scientists until their parents got hold of them, changed careers. But I've seen more abrupt endings of scientific careers. I was sitting in a room when I was an undergraduate at Yale, in a room that sloped a little bit more dramatically than this, but you know, it's one of these amphitheater kinds. And there was a professor of chemistry, Professor During, who's well-known organic chemist. And we were all in this organic chemistry class aspiring to be either doctors or something, I don't know. But this friend of mine who was sitting next to me, this is the moment when he realized that he might not make it as a scientist. They had blue book exams, and they were handing out these blue book exams, and people would look at them like, oh. And I looked at mine, and it was 60, I thought I was a smart guy, but 60, well, maybe it's out of 60, you know. And the guy next to me had a 65. And I thought, this is really sad. You know, here I was all my life, I was told I was a smart person, I was 60. And sitting next to me was my friend, Tuggle, who made this strange noise. and Professor During started into his lecture, and Tuggle sort of stumbled down from the last, we were in the last row, of course, down the steps, and During is, you're up, standing up, and Tuggle comes up and puts this blue book and says, "What is that?" During looks at it. "Well, Mr. Tuggle, it's a 5. That was the end of another scientific. Tuggle discovered in a moment that he really hadn't been that interested in medicine after all. But one of the things that strikes me about this teaching of science is that, and again, this is just strictly personal, and we're going subjective approaches to this, is that the stuff is so interesting. You know, fundamentally, I made a list of interesting things: the mind, quantum theory, evolution, cosmology, genetics, complexity. These things are not just interesting in a limited way, they're fundamentally interesting. And they can be made interesting to people. But somewhere along the line, people have gotten the notion that this stuff is like poison. I tried an experiment on my daughter, the anthropologist, before she was about to go to Wesleyan. And she, as I said, had shown no interest in science, in these kinds of issues. And particularly physical science, she thought was just, well, anyway. And I was at a dinner where I was giving a talk. It was a wonderful occasion, and I got parked at a table. On the one hand was Linus Pauling, a table about this big. I'd taken my daughter to this thing with me, and sitting next to me is Joshua Lederberg. So Lederberg, of course, dabbled in computer science quite successfully, I might say. And so he and I sort of, I mean, I knew him in a big way, and he deigned to know me in a sort of little way. And so I said to him, hoping to influence my daughter, "Josh, how did you get interested in science?" Thinking he would say something that would influence her to go off to Wesleyan, where she was about to go and take science courses. He said, "Tony, when I was 6, I used to go to the New York Public Library and read books on physics." My daughter looked at me like, and started doodling on her napkin. But there is this sort of sense of trying to reclaim with students all the way along this intelligence and interest that they have in lots of these questions. Because I really do believe, as Piaget really called lots of these kids, he said basically they're epistemologists. I mean, they're really very interested in the way you know things and the way you come to know things. So somewhere along the lines, we all know many of them get disabused of their interest in this. And yet it strikes me, Rice University specifically, that it is really remarkable, and in some sense remarkably sad, that the preponderance or large number of our students will leave here with only the barest knowledge of these wonderfully interesting ways of looking at the world, whether it be quantum mechanics or evolution, whatever. And obviously that's part of that's the focus of this discussion in these meetings, how we can change that. But it's very important, I think, to address these questions. I think there's some
gain vision for the first time as adults. They have been blind all their life, and they see as adults for the first time. And there was a story in the New York Times last spring, not the New York Times, excuse me, the New Yorker, describing this, and what a difficult time the man had for months seeing. There was just such a riot of sensory input, and he had no culturally mediated sensors in place to filter it and make any sense of it. And this is what children are doing. And if parents know this, they ask their children, if you ask your children objective, neutral questions, what do you see? What do you notice? The things that they come back with are extraordinary and things you cannot see yourselves until you're cued to see them by their vision. We lose that, and that's a cultural process.
The terrible mischief of efficiency is partly what you're talking about. You bring to mind another thing that's going on today that I think I should just offer to your contemplations. People have worried about the computer dehumanizing us. In fact, what all of us are finding is that once we get on the nets, once we get on the computer networks, we suddenly become as children again. It is a whole new way of seeing. When I talk to you and you talk to me, we have instinctive shields that come up in the mind-to-mouth short circuit. I mean, we've learned to protect ourselves and block. You get onto the nets, suddenly those shields, we haven't developed those for the mind-to-finger connection. And you find wonderful self-exposure going on in the best sense of the word. In the best sense of the word.
And I just wanted to finish the thought that the cultural processes that go on are extremely important to understand. And of course, anthropology brought them to us by looking at other peoples who actually, we found out, saw the world. That the visual experience of the world for them was different than ours. And we realized that observing was a culturally mediated process, which leads us to the practice of science depending on observation. The observations, as much as we focus on the process we want to understand, our eyes are always, there are filters in place because the practice of science is a cultural practice, which leads me to a conclusion that anthropology is probably more substantial than perhaps Tony Gory might have thought. Hard science, a little less hard than we might have hoped.
Anthropology has to be the science of making a familiar stranger. You'll never understand intimacy.
Any other questions? Comments?
Yeah, I didn't say it was.
Oh, he
said
did.
it was malleable.
He said malleable. Nevertheless, Lloyd. Lloyd?
I'm sitting next to my friend from 1950 to 1954 on this ground. Bob Curl and I were classmates together. And when I think back to studying chemistry with Jared Mosser and biology with Dr. Davies and physics with Claude Heaps, and wonder why I am now a historian of science, I can say that it's because of the failure of those teachers then. I knew something was god-awful wrong in the early 50s. And I sought a solution for it. And the Two Cultures lectures of C.P. Snow came out in 1957 as I was coming back to become an eternal student. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But the religious experience of discovering the history of science was for me that, the religious experience, and a way of handling the problem of looking backward and forward at the same time, of being a Janus figure, of being an Aristotelian and a Platonist. And I want to simply reinforce Bill Russell's remark at the end of this morning's session about the power of the history of science to bridge the gulfs between our various subcultures. Thank you, John. I very much appreciate your comment.
Any other comments? I have a comment. It's been remarked about the relationship between art and science at different times, and I would like to thank John Leonhardt for bringing a sense of poetry to the occasion, because he has in a very mesmerizing way, and that in its own right is very important, because afterwards we will have our reception.
I realize I'm holding you from practical biotechnology, form fermentation, and that sort. So I'm only going to take a meeting. I would just like to add my thanks to all the speakers, the panelists, and to the organizers of this conference. It brought something very important to our campus. I've just learned an immense amount today. I hope we'll all take the messages home and act upon them in their own way. I do think it's worthwhile commenting upon the irony of the eloquence with which people have stood in front of us in a single lecture format and explained so well to us how that's a failed method. New information. All of this business is fraught with ironies and self-contradictions. There is no single solution, and we have to keep looking all the time. Tony Gorey's list of fascinating subjects each of us could add to. There are all kinds of things. It's hard to imagine why somebody wouldn't find those things fascinating and want to do them. And one of the things that struck me when I was listening to his list is we conceal those from the students. We don't let them get to those kind of things until they have suffered through this kind of initiation period. And we've done that because we have this sort of idea that knowledge is sequential and you mustn't learn B before you've learned A, in spite of the fact that each of us